All right. Well, hello, everybody. This is Rich Eisen, and you are with the open mic. Thanks again for joining us here for my regular series where I speak with authors about their work and sometimes about the publishing industry. I'm here today with one of my favorite authors, Meghan Holloway, who has a brand new book out today, her first venture into the novella realm and a few others. We're going to talk with her here in just a second. Before we get into that, let me remind you, if you haven't already done so, please hit the subscribe button below. I have a lot more author interviews lined up in the coming weeks, and hopefully you'll find all of those as interesting as you find this one. So, and I'm sure you're going to find this one interesting, because as I say, this is one of my favorite authors. So without further ado, let's get started. Meghan, how are you doing today?
I am doing well, Rich. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you today.
Oh, absolutely. You're surviving the weather okay?
Yes, we had a bit of ice and snow last night and into today, but we're surviving, still have our power on, so that's always
Yes,
a good
thank
thing.
gosh.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about your new novella, which is titled Library of Lost Souls, which
Yes.
I read in the last few days. Uh, this marks a series of firsts for you. It's your first novella. It's your first foray into science fiction, and it's the first time you've self-published
It is.
something. For those who maybe are not familiar with Meghan's work, her first novel release was a thriller, Onto the Breach, which was fabulous. One of the better books of 2019. I
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed. You also write crime fiction, which is you've got one of those coming out later in the year, and we'll talk
I
about that
do.
later on. But let's focus now on the book that just came out today, February 16th. Um, Tell me a little bit about it. You know, what was the driving inspiration for you for this?
You know, it was never really a story that I intended to write. I had finished my current work in progress, another work of historical fiction. I was researching for my next book, and I was sitting at my kitchen table one night working on a watercolor painting, and I just had this strange scene that came into my head of this woman searching through like these hologram files in the basement of an Athenaeum. And that scene evolved into this story about the mass extinction of the human race. And it was one of those things that very much evolved out of the last year, out of the pandemic. And it became something that I really was able to kind of process my own grief and isolation throughout the last year through this story. It was so fun to write. It was so cathartic to write. And as you said, it was such a first for me in so many realms. It was my first novella, and I love that format so much. I've always been intrigued by the novella and just this tight, taut storytelling where you have to condense things to the bare minimum to get your story across to readers. For sci-fi, I kind of had this Isaac Asimov kind of idea with it that I was aiming for. And then my first entry into self-publishing, it was one of those things where I was writing the story and I thought, I don't really know what I'm going to do with this. I don't have an anthology that I'm writing. My publisher, most publishers don't really publish single novellas, and I thought, well, this is the time and place to experiment with that format and see how it goes.
Well, you know, it is interesting that I think a lot of things that have come out of the pandemic have, um, I think there's, you know, challenges around creativity, challenges around staying motivated, challenges around the uncertainty of the industry. And I find it really interesting that you chose to tackle something new. Did you ever consider, you know, running it past an agent or, you know, trying to go that route? Or was this always something where you said, you know, this is personal enough to me that I want to just make sure that it gets done and I get it out there?
This was the latter for sure. This was one thing. I wrote this novella in the span of a month, and I knew that the story that I was telling was so personal to me, just exploring loss and loneliness, that I wanted it to be available to readers for them, for anyone who's experienced loss, not just in the last year with COVID-19, but throughout their lives, just to have that kind of shared experience. I've I've talked with a lot of friends about how this whole experience over the last year feels so collective, like we have this collective sense of grief and loss and this strange detachment from the world that we knew prior to 2020. And it was one of those things that I knew I wanted to write this story and then get it into the hands of readers, because I feel like they can relate to the emotion that is the bedrock of this story.
Hmm. Well, and I know some of the loss we're talking about for you is personal. I believe you lost your grandfather to COVID. Is that
I
correct?
did. I did. It was it was one of the most difficult losses that I faced, not just because he was so dear to me and such an influential part of my life. I would not be the storyteller that I am without my grandfather's influence. Some of my earliest memories are of him, of begging him to tell me stories about his childhood. And he was just the consummate storyteller himself. He could never just have a straight conversation with you. It was always filled with all of these tells, and who knew how tall those tells were.
Right.
And it was the loss was compounded simply because of the quarantine and not being able to see him in that last year of his life, not being able to spend those last moments with him. It was really a tragedy. And for me, I'm very private with my grief, but I also felt like so many other people had experienced this similar type of grief of being
Hmm.
separated from their loved ones over the last year, and many who have lost their loved ones over the last year and been unable to spend those last moments with them, been unable to celebrate their life in a funeral or a wake. And so when I've written, a lot of my stories are underpinned by these explorations of grief and loss. And I've always been drawn to those types of stories. But the Library of Lost Souls was really my first venture into exploring my own grief and loss. And it made it such a more personal story to me. And it's one of those things that it's been difficult to talk about, but I've wanted to talk about it because I know so many people are sharing in this experience.
Well, it's one of the things I certainly took from the story. As I noted, this is science fiction, but really at its heart, this is a love story and set in a the science fiction genre. Um, Maybe talk about that a little bit, because there was, for your main character, such a sense of loss, of this longing for her husband, and this opportunity that she sees to maybe get a chance to reunite with him on some even a remote way. It was so
Mhm.
important to her, and of course that evolves over the course of the story. But maybe talk a little bit about how this really is as much a love story as it is a piece of science fiction.
It is. And when I was talking about it with other people, I used the term love story so loosely. And early friends who read this work, they're like, this is not really a romance. And I'm like, no, it's definitely not a traditional romance, but it's a love story about grief and about loss and loneliness and how we process those emotions. And really, at the heart of it, it's this story about what makes us human, what it is to be human. And I think at the end of the day, any story that explores those type of emotions has to be a sort of love story at the end. And it's definitely something that I aim for, because people talk about the stages of grief and the process that you go through when you experience a loss. And there's always this kind of transformation that you go through with the anger and the loneliness and the being able to try to wrap your mind around the fact that someone is actually gone. And at the end of the day, you still have those memories and you still have those moments and that remnant of companionship that you had with that individual. And that's a love story at the end of the day, as sad as a love story as it is.
Yeah, it was not that dissimilar to the theme of your first book,
Mhm.
which was set in World War II, and had certainly the trappings of it was a great thriller. Certainly, as I say, it had the trappings of stories told from that era and that genre. But it really that was also a love story.
It
It was
was.
between father and son, and who desperately trying to find out what happened to his son.
Mhm.
And, I thought it was incredibly compelling. How much of what you've learned from your other writing do you pull into a story like this that is set in such a different genre than
Mhm.
those other writings?
Well, and I think at the end of the day, regardless of the genre that you're writing in, you're telling human stories and you're delving into human experience and telling those stories that are universal, regardless of genre, regardless of time period. You're telling a story about human experience, about human endeavor, and that's the same across genres. You're always digging into that root of the story. And with writing thrillers and writing historical fiction, it's both. I like to split my stories between being character driven and plot driven. Obviously, I want a very riveting narrative that you cannot escape, that just keeps you gripped to the page. But I also want to do these deep character studies that give you this insight into why these characters have gotten to this point in their life and why they make the decisions that they are making at that point in time in the story. And that was really something that I found was not that different in writing a science fiction. Obviously, the world looked very different, but I was still delving into that same human experience, human endeavor, exploring the human spirit and those labyrinths of the heart. And it was so much fun to write that what I've been writing in these other genres that are so familiar to people and in a world that looks familiar to people, even the historical era, and putting that kind of story in a different setting that looks so dissimilar to what we're experiencing now. It was a really fun challenge, and it was fun to kind of rack my brain and try to think of what could the world look like in 150, 100 years. How
Right.
could society have evolved? And that was really where I dug into the science fiction and had a lot of fun with imagining the what if of the world.
Well, I do think it's one of the great aspects of the story is that, I agree with you totally when it comes to, regardless of what genre you're writing in, you have to be able to connect, human emotions for the reader. The reader has to see some semblance of themselves or their world in it,
Mhm.
even if it's a completely different world. Uh,
Yes.
the humanity of it all is the real ticket there as far as being a reader. And I read such a vast array, wide range of stuff, and I do find it off-putting when the plot um, overtakes the
Mhm.
humanity of a story.
Mhm.
So, you know, given that you have that mindset, do you see yourself writing more in sci-fi, with that theme in mind, with that, bringing that kind of humanity to sci-fi? Is that something you can see yourself doing more of in the future?
I never say no to future projects. I always try to leave myself open to the ideas that come to me, to the narratives that I want to tell, regardless of what world those exist in. I don't have anything planned at the moment in sci-fi, but I had so much fun creating that world and thinking of how a very human story would evolve at the end of the human race. And so I won't say that I will never revisit that, because I could definitely see more stories evolving out of that setting and out of that narrative and that time and place.
Do you read a lot of science fiction? Is that something that has always interested you, or was this something that came up because of our current situation with the pandemic?
It really came up out of the current situation with the pandemic, but I've always been so inspired and impressed by science fiction authors and fantasy authors. There's just this whole new level of creativity and imagination that these authors explore. And I've always been so impressed by their work. I've always said, I don't know if I have quite the imagination for that, but I had so much fun writing it. So I definitely want to read more in the genre and leave myself open to those future stories.
One of the things about sci-fi, I think that we hear all the time, maybe to the point of it feeling a little overdone, is things that are dystopian. And I
Mm.
think certainly over the last few years, a lot of us have felt like we're living in a somewhat dystopian world. And
For sure.
so, which makes me think it would almost discourage people from reading something like that, which
Mhm.
again was why I really liked the novella that your book, Library of Lost Souls, because it did have that humanity to it. And even though the world was very different, and we know that in your story, the human race is not doing so well,
Oh.
it didn't feel dystopian, if
Mhm.
that makes sense to anybody who's listening to this going, how is that possible? But did that enter into your thinking too, that you needed to have some level of optimism maybe in writing this?
I think so. Well, and like I said earlier about grief, I feel like you always have to reach this point in your processing of it where you cling to the hope and you cling to the memories. And at the end of the day, that's embracing a sense of positivity and optimism about the future. And it was one of those things where in this story, I wanted to tell a story about the end of the human race, but it wasn't brought on by anyone else. The human extinction was just the natural evolution of our future. And I think I don't know what the future holds for us, but I think you see that in a lot of other species, how they eventually die out. And I don't, and when I was exploring this idea, I thought this is kind of the natural conclusion to what our current situation looks like. And hopefully it's not, of course, but that was kind of where my mind was going with that. And it was one of those things where I wanted it to be a story where a woman was attempting to find peace with that end, and where she was attempting to find consolation, almost companionship for those remaining years that she had when she knew that the human race was going to end and she wanted that sliver of herself to live on.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about some of your other work. As I
Mhm.
mentioned your first book, which I really love, but you've got other works. Uh, for those who maybe are just learning about your work, which was not science fiction, uh, let's first of all, again, let me ask you a little bit about Onto the
Mhm.
Breach, because that definitely was a standalone from
Mhm.
everything I see. I don't see where you would maybe, but you had your other work as a series.
It
So,
is, yes.
um, tell me about your current work in progress. And I know you've got one coming out later in the year. And like I say, we'll talk later in the year too when that comes out. But right now, let's tell me a little bit about what that is, and where you're at in that process.
So, Once More Into the Breach was my first foray into historical fiction. And I wrote that story really thinking that that was my ultimate goal as an author, was to write this epic World War II story that was a love story about a father and a son. And when I finished that book, I honestly thought, okay, that's it for me. I won't write any more historical fiction. That was my goal. That was my dream book that I wrote. And now I'll go on, I'll write a crime fiction trilogy. But I finished my crime fiction trilogy. The second book releases in August. And I just found myself drawn back into the World War II era. And it was one of those stories that had been on my mind for several years. And it was kind of percolating in the back of my brain as I was writing this crime fiction trilogy. It's a very different story from Once More Into the Breach, and in the point that it is fully embracing a female perspective and a female experience during the war. And so I've had a lot of fun diving back into World War II. And I will never say any longer that that was my last book in this genre or anything like that, because as I explore these different genres, the historical fiction, the crime fiction, I'm always coming up with different ways to delve back into that period because it's so enjoyable for me.
Well, historical fiction has always been interesting to me too, and I'm always curious about the degree of research that goes into this. I'm a reporter for a living, so research is a big part of my life.
Mhm.
But I I couldn't fathom what it must take to be able to delve into an era where most of the people from that era are not with us anymore.
Mhm.
And so, you really can't rely just on talking to people like I do when I talk to people for a living. You have, when you do historical fiction, you really have to do research into figuring out, because people who read that will point out every little thing
Oh,
you might have got wrong.
absolutely.
So, talk a little bit about the process that you go through when you are doing a piece of historical fiction.
For me, my background is in library and information science. So I am a researcher at heart, and I love delving into that side of writing historical fiction. It's actually harder for me to finally start the story because I get so caught up and embroiled in the research for it that I find myself finding a lot of rabbit holes that I end up chasing
Mhm.
because it's just so interesting and fascinating. But I usually start with reference books and then boil it down to more um, concrete information and primary sources specifically about the era, the place, or the experiences that I'm writing about. And so I usually have a stack of 3 or 4 reference books to have that kind of 30,000-foot view of the war. And then I descend in altitude as I am researching and get right into the heart of the story that I'm attempting to tell.
You know, one other thing I guess that's interesting in that book, your main character was a man.
Mhm.
And there's such a big deal in this day and age about men writing women, women writing men, or people, writing other cultures. When you, does that play a factor in anything when you write? Do you think, oh, I really want to tell this from a man's perspective, or really want to tell it from a woman's perspective? And if so, in what way?
I think you have to be very cognizant of writing the other. And really, when you think about it, any experience aside from your very own is an other experience.
Right.
And I think you have to honor the honor that other experience. I think you have to portray it authentically. And I think that's challenging. And I think that really stretches an author's skills. But I think it's something that you have to be very dedicated to, because if I wrote a book and I wrote a book from a male perspective that was heavily influenced by my own female perspective, readers would come back to me and say, this didn't really feel like a male character. This didn't really feel like an authentic male perspective. And I think you have to be very conscious of that. I think you have to be very diligent of that. And it all comes down to honoring that other experience and doing the best to your ability to make that an authentic experience for the reader.
I don't want to keep you too long, but this is something of really great interest to me. So you have written historical fiction, crime fiction, science fiction slash love story. In this very truncated publishing market of 2021, most agents, editors, publishing people will tell you, don't jump around genres. Get one, stick to it. You're going to confuse people. For those who don't know, this is a very negative industry in a lot of ways. Um, but that clearly hasn't bothered you, and you're clearly skilled at writing in all of these areas.
Thank you.
Did you, do you ever see yourself settling into one thing, or did you ever consider maybe going the route that a lot of authors do, which is having a pen name that they use, or something to differentiate and separate so you don't alter your brand that you've created with the success of one thing? What's your perspective on writing genres as a professional writer?
Mm.
How do you approach that?
That was something I was really concerned about from going from Once More into the Breach, my historical fiction, to Hunting Ground, my first crime thriller. And it was one of those things where I was worried about polluting my brand that I was creating. And at the end of the day, I think that readers just want stories to read. They want worlds to experience, characters to dive into. And I think that we don't give readers enough credit a lot of times when they find an author or story that they really enjoy. I think that readers will travel across genres, with an author when they trust that author. And I try to be an author that my readers can trust, to know that I'm going to take them on this journey. And yes, it may be dark, it may be gritty, it may be hard to read, but at the end of the day, even if it takes 3 books, I'm going to give you a hopeful ending, and an ending that is satisfying. And it is tricky in this day and age because there is that concern about your brand. But like I said, I think we have to trust readers to find those stories that we want to tell. And I think that I may be exploring all of these different genres, working toward finding that kind of perfect story that I want to tell the readers. And I'm experimenting in the different ways of doing that. I keep finding myself drawn back to historical fiction though. And so will I only ever write historical fiction at some point? I don't ever like to say never to any story that comes to me, but I do kind of feel like that is more my path going forward in my career as an author. But like I said, I'm always open to exploring those other stories, crossing those genre labels and seeing what's out there, and trying to find that readership that trusts me to tell a good story.
Well, I like to wrap things up as always with a question I mean to be fun. I hope it's fun for you and for everyone else. I like to offer you the opportunity. Let's just say I was someone who could offer you the opportunity to have a conversation with one of the following 3 people. Tell me who you would choose and why. I'll offer you, let's go with Isaac Asimov, the great science fiction writer. Let's go with Douglas MacArthur, who I think most people would know from his military career.
Mm-hmm.
And let's go with Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the great women from American history of the 20th century.
Goodness.
I can put you together with one of those 3 people. Who would you choose?
Not all 3. That dinner with all 3 would be ideal.
Wouldn't that be fabulous?
It would be. It would be.
I'm good, but I'm not that good. I can only produce one of them.
I would have to go with Eleanor. She was such a strong figure and such a powerful force in history, in the women's movement. And I think that she played such a pivotal role in history and in that era. I'd have to sit down and have dinner with her and pick her brain about her experience and her life and her stories that she has to tell.
That would be fun too. I absolutely agree with you. Well, for those who might be interested in Meghan's work, which I highly recommend, you can find her work on most of the obvious places that you buy books. But tell me now, since you self-published the novella, is that through your website, or is that also going to be available other places?
So it is available through your favorite e-readers, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Apple Books. It's available on all of those platforms. It will also be available through Overdrive, through the library apps. So I've tried to make it as accessible to people as I can.
Great, fabulous. Well, thank you again for joining us today. Stay with me for just a moment while I take us out here. For all you, thanks again for joining us today on the open mic. And coming up in the next few weeks, I'll be having conversations with the great crime fiction writer, Tracy Clark. And that's my cue for all of us to head out because as always, hey, I'm working from home these days, folks. And, this is my crew off to the side here. So that's the cue for me to wrap it up.
They say it's time for a walk.
Again, appreciate it. And again, I have Tracy Clark coming up. The great sports writer, Jeff Pearlman, will be coming up. A few others, Erica Mailman, one of the great historical fiction authors out there. She'll be coming up. I have some more folks that we're trying to get scheduled. So thanks again for joining us, and we will see you next time on the open mic.
Thank you so much, Rich.
Sure.